Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something darker than a basement rave at 4 a.m. The strange, seductive, and ultimately terrifying world of GHB, the drug ravers called liquid ecstasy. Not because it was ecstasy, spoiler alert it wasn't, but because in the sweaty, strobe-lit chaos of the 90s club scene, GHB promised euphoria, connection, and a high that felt like melting into pure bliss. What it delivered was blackouts, overdoses, and a one-way ticket to the hospital if you were lucky. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to Jessica from Portland who suggested this topic. Your recommendation helps shape this channel more than you know, and I'm genuinely grateful. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 3 in the morning somewhere, and honestly that feels appropriate for this one. By the way, the channel's now live on Spotify, so if you prefer listening there, check out the link in the description. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe keep a glass of water nearby because this story gets dark, fast, and a little sticky. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like inside those packed underground raves where everyone was dancing like their lives depended on it? What made a clear, odorless liquid in a tiny bottle seem like the key to a perfect night? How did a drug originally created in a lab for completely legitimate medical reasons end up in the sweaty palms of club kids looking for one more high? Why would anyone willingly drink something that tasted like salty drain cleaner mixed with regret? And how did GHB go from party enhancer to predator's weapon in less than a decade? Could you have spotted the difference between someone having fun and someone overdosing in a room where everyone looked half dead already? Would you have trusted your drink at a rave in 1997? Or would you have been the cautious one watching everyone else spiral? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1994. The rave scene is exploding. The beats are relentless, the lights are blinding, and in the corner, someone just handed you a tiny bottle cap filled with liquid that smells like the ocean died. They're smiling. They say it'll change your life. They're not wrong, but not in the way you think. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning. Back when GHB wasn't a party drug at all, it was science. Gamma-hydroxybutyrate, try saying that 3 times fast after a few drinks, was first synthesized in the early 1960s by a French researcher named Henri Laborie. He was looking for a safer alternative to anesthesia, something that could put patients to sleep without the nasty side effects of existing drugs. And for a while, it worked. GHB was clean, efficient, and seemed almost gentle compared to the harsh chemicals doctors were using at the time. But here's where things get interesting. GHB didn't just knock you out. At lower doses, it made people feel relaxed, euphoric, and strangely sociable. It was like alcohol without the hangover, or so they thought. By the 1980s, bodybuilders stumbled onto it, claiming it boosted growth hormone production and helped build muscle while you slept. Health food stores started selling it over the counter in little bottles with labels that promised better sleep, more energy, and a body like a Greek god. No prescription needed, no warnings attached, just a clear liquid that tasted like Satan's bathwater but apparently delivered results. And that's how a legitimate medical experiment quietly slipped out of the lab into the gym and eventually onto the dance floor, where it would become one of the most controversial drugs of the 90s rave scene. Laborie himself probably never imagined his anesthetic research would end up in plastic water bottles at underground raves. He was studying how the brain responded to different sedatives, trying to understand consciousness itself. GHB seemed promising because it occurred naturally in the human brain in tiny amounts. It was endogenous, meaning your body already made it. The thinking was, if it's already in there, how dangerous could a little more be? Turns out, very dangerous. But that wouldn't become clear for decades. In the medical world, GHB showed promise but never quite took off as an anesthetic. It was unpredictable. Some patients would go under smoothly. Others would experience disturbing hallucinations or wake up confused and agitated. The therapeutic window, the gap between an effective dose and a dangerous dose, was uncomfortably narrow. So mainstream medicine moved on to other options, safer options, drugs that didn't require such precise dosing. GHB was relegated to obscure medical journals and forgotten conference presentations, but the bodybuilding community, they weren't reading medical journals. They were reading muscle magazines, swapping tips in gym locker rooms, and always looking for the next edge. When someone discovered that GHB might stimulate growth hormone release during deep sleep, it spread through the fitness world like wildfire. Didn't matter that the science was shaky at best. Didn't matter that nobody really understood the long-term effects. It was cheap, it was legal, and guys were swearing it worked. Supplement companies jumped on the trend. Either they bottled GHB under names that sounded scientific and legitimate: Reviverant, Renutrient, Gamma-OH, Blue Nitro. The labels were covered in muscular torsos and promises of natural growth enhancement, and because it was classified as a dietary supplement, not a drug, the FDA didn't regulate it. You could walk into a GNC or a local health food store and buy a bottle right off the shelf, sandwiched between protein powder and creatine. The dosing instructions were vague at best, criminally negligent at worst. Take 1 to 2 capsules before bed. That was it. No mention of body weight, tolerance, or what would happen if you took 3 capsules instead of 2. No warnings about mixing it with alcohol or other sedatives. Just a cheerful promise that you'd wake up more rested and more jacked. For a while, it seemed harmless enough. Bodybuilders were taking it, sleeping deeply, waking up, hitting the gym. Some reported bizarre dreams, night sweats, or morning grogginess, but nothing that seemed alarming. The muscle magazines published glowing testimonials. The supplement industry raked in profits, and GHB quietly built its reputation as a miracle substance. But beneath the surface, problems were already brewing. Emergency rooms were starting to see strange cases. Young men arriving unconscious, with no obvious cause. Toxicology screens came back negative for the usual suspects: alcohol, opioids, cocaine. Doctors were baffled. What were these guys taking? Eventually someone would mention a supplement, some liquid thing from the health food store, and the doctors would shrug, write it off as an isolated incident and move on. Nobody connected the dots yet. Nobody realized they were seeing the beginning of an epidemic. Meanwhile, word about GHB's euphoric effects at lower doses was spreading beyond the gym. People noticed that if you didn't take enough to pass out, if you found that sweet spot, it felt good, really good, warm, relaxing, social, better than a few beers and without the calories, and that's when GHB started its slow migration from the supplement shelf to the party scene. It wasn't sudden. There was no announcement, no marketing campaign. It just quietly slipped into a new world, carried in gym bags and passed between friends who had no idea what they were really playing with. Before ravers got their hands on it, GHB belonged to the gym rats. In the mid-1980s, bodybuilding culture was obsessed with growth hormone, the holy grail of muscle development. Real growth hormone was expensive, hard to get, and required injections. But GHB, that was cheap, legal, and supposedly did the same thing by triggering your body's natural growth hormone release while you slept. Supplement companies marketed it as a miracle. Take a capsule before bed, wake up more shredded, sleep deeper, recover faster. It sounded too good to be true, and of course, it was. But in those early days, nobody knew that yet. The bottles sat on the shelves of health food stores right next to protein powder and vitamin C, labelled as dietary supplements with names like Revivarant, Renutrient, and Gamma-OH. The FDA hadn't caught up yet, so bodybuilders chugged it religiously, swapping dosing tips in locker rooms and gym parking lots. Some of them felt amazing, deeper sleep, better workouts, and a weird sense of euphoria that made the whole experience feel almost mystical. Others felt dizzy, nauseous, or woke up drenched in sweat with their heart pounding like a drum solo. But side effects were just part of the game, right? You wanted gains, you paid the price. What nobody realised, or maybe nobody wanted to admit, was that the line between effective dose and dangerous dose was terrifyingly thin. One capful too many, and you weren't waking up shredded. You were waking up in the emergency room, or not waking up at all. The gym culture of the 80s was built on extremes. Guys were injecting steroids in bathroom stalls, downing handfuls of questionable supplements, and eating chicken breasts 6 times a day. Health was secondary to aesthetics, so when GHB came along promising growth hormone stimulation without needles, without prescriptions, without even breaking the law, it seemed like a no-brainer. The fact that it tasted like industrial runoff mixed with seawater, minor inconvenience. You held your nose, knocked it back, and chased it with Gatorade. The science behind GHB's supposed muscle-building effects was thin at best. Yes, deep sleep does trigger growth hormone release, and yes, GHB could induce deep sleep. But whether that translated into actual muscle growth? Questionable. Most of the evidence was anecdotal, guys swearing they'd gained 5 pounds of lean mass in a month, attributing it to GHB without accounting for the steroids, the creatine, the brutal training regimen, or the fact that they were eating like competitive eaters preparing for a championship. But anecdotal evidence was enough. In a community where bros trusted other bros more than scientists, word of mouth was gospel. If Big Tony from the squat rack said GHB worked, then it worked, and if you weren't using it, you were falling behind. That competitive mentality pushed guys to try it even when they were skeptical, even when they'd heard stories about people passing out or getting sick. Because not trying it meant maybe missing out on an edge, and in bodybuilding, edges were everything. The dosing was pure chaos. Some guys took a teaspoon, some took a tablespoon, some measured it in bottle caps, but bottle caps varied wildly in size, and because GHB concentrations weren't standardized, different brands, different batches, different dilution levels, you never really knew how much you were taking. One guy's safe dose could be another guy's ticket to the ER, and then there were the horror stories that got whispered about but never taken seriously enough. The guy who took GHB before bed and didn't wake up for 18 hours, missing work and scaring his wife half to death. The competitive bodybuilder who collapsed in the gym parking lot after taking a dose too close to his workout. The supplement store employee who tried it for the first time, passed out in his apartment, and woke up 6 hours later on the kitchen floor with no memory of how he got there. These stories circulated, but they were always framed as user error. He took too much. He didn't follow the instructions. He must have mixed it with something else. The idea that GHB itself might be fundamentally dangerous? That didn't fit the narrative. Supplement companies did nothing to discourage use. In fact, they actively promoted it. Yeah, plastering bodybuilding magazines with ads featuring impossibly muscular models and testimonials from satisfied customers. The bottles came with minimal warnings, if any. The labels were vague and optimistic, and because it was classified as a supplement, not a pharmaceutical, there was no legal requirement for rigorous safety testing or clear dosing guidelines. For years, bodybuilders were essentially beta testing an unregulated sedative, playing pharmacist with their own bodies and hoping for the best. Some got lucky. They found a dose that worked, stuck to it religiously, and never had a problem. But others weren't so lucky. They pushed it too far, mixed it with alcohol at a post-competition party, or took a batch that was stronger than usual. And that's when GHB stopped being a performance enhancer and became a life-threatening gamble. By the late 80s, emergency rooms near major gyms were seeing a pattern. young, muscular men arriving unconscious with no clear explanation. Toxicology screens came back mostly clean. No recreational drugs, no alcohol poisoning. Eventually, doctors started piecing it together. These guys were all taking the same supplement, same clear liquid, same salty taste, same bottles from the health food store. And that's when the medical community started paying attention. Not enough to stop it yet, but enough to start documenting cases, publishing warnings, and quietly sounding the alarm that something dangerous was hiding on the supplement shelf right next to the multivitamins. By the early 1990s, our rave culture had erupted across Europe and was spreading like wildfire through the underground clubs and warehouses of America. This wasn't your parents' nightclub with velvet ropes and cocktail waitresses. Raves were lawless, sweaty, all-night marathons of pounding electronic music, strobe lights, and a crowd united by one goal: lose yourself in the beat. And to really lose yourself, people needed help. Enter the party drugs: ecstasy, LSD, ketamine, and eventually GHB. At first, GHB was just another option in the chemical buffet. Ravers heard about it from bodybuilders, from word of mouth, from that one guy who always seemed to know where to get the good stuff. It was cheap, easy to make, and produced a high that was distinctly different from everything else on the menu. Where ecstasy made you love everyone, GHB made you love yourself, deeply, warmly, like sinking into the world's softest couch while the bass rattled your bones. It loosened inhibitions, made dancing feel effortless, and created this dreamy, sensual vibe that felt perfect for the late-night hours when the music slowed down and people started pairing off in dark corners. Unlike ecstasy, which kept you wired for hours, GHB had a gentler arc. You'd feel it kick in within 15 minutes, ride the wave for a few hours, and then coast back down. Or at least that was the plan. Because GHB had a dark side that nobody wanted to talk about at first. The dose that got you high and the dose that knocked you unconscious were way too close together. And in the chaos of a rave, where people were already dehydrated, drunk, or mixing drugs, that thin margin became a ticking time bomb. The rave scene in the 90s was built on a philosophy called PLUR: peace, love, unity, respect. It was supposed to be about transcending the everyday grind, connecting with strangers through music, creating a temporary utopia where everyone was equal under the spinning lights. And for a while, in the early days, it genuinely felt like that. People shared water, looked out for each other, and danced until the sun came up without a hint of aggression or judgment. But as the scene grew, as it moved from secret warehouse parties to massive events with thousands of attendees, the culture shifted. The drugs became less about enhancing the experience and more about achieving oblivion, and GHB fit perfectly into that darker evolution. It wasn't the empathogenic, touchy-feely drug that ecstasy was. It didn't make you want to hug strangers and tell them your life story. GHB was more selfish, more internal. It made you feel good in your own body, in your own skin, without needing anyone else. And in a scene that was getting increasingly crowded, increasingly commercial, and increasingly exhausting, that kind of self-contained high had its appeal. GHB also became popular because it was seen as cleaner than some of the other drugs floating around. There was no smoking involved, no needles, no pills that might be cut with God knows what. It was just a liquid. Clear, simple, and this was the dangerous part somehow that made it seem safer. People thought, it's basically water with a kick. How bad can it be? Very bad, as it turned out. But that realization came slowly, one overdose at a time. The drug made its way into the rave scene through multiple channels. Some people brought it over from the bodybuilding world, where they'd been using it for sleep and recovery. Others heard about it through underground drug forums or from dealers who were always looking for the next thing to sell. And because GHB was still legal and available over the counter in many places during the early 90s, it was easy to get. You didn't need a sketchy dealer in a dark alley. You could literally buy it at a health food store, then show up at a rave and share it with your friends like you were handing out samples of some exotic health tonic. The social dynamics of rave culture also facilitated GHB's spread. People trusted each other in a way that was both beautiful and dangerous. If someone offered you something, you assumed they had your best interests at heart. You didn't interrogate them about dosage or purity or what else might be in the bottle. You just took it, because that's what you did at raves. You shared, you trusted, you embraced the collective experience, and that openness, while genuine and well-intentioned, created vulnerabilities that would be exploited in horrifying ways later on. As GHB became more common, the overdoses started piling up. At first, they were sporadic, 1 or 2 per event, written off as isolated incidents. Maybe the person had mixed it with too much alcohol. Maybe they'd taken too much. Maybe they just couldn't handle it. But as the 90s wore on, as raves got bigger and GHB got more popular, the overdoses became impossible to ignore. Paramedics started recognizing the pattern. Young people, unconscious, but unresponsive, often with friends who had no idea what they'd taken or how much. The hospitals filled up every weekend with rave casualties, and GHB was increasingly the culprit. The rave scene's response was complicated. Some people stopped using it immediately, terrified by the stories they were hearing. Others doubled down, convinced that the overdoses were just user error, that if you were smart and careful, you could use GHB without problems. And then there were those who kept using it despite the risks because the high was just that good, that addictive, that worth gambling your life on. It was a chemical Russian roulette, and every weekend more people pulled the trigger. What nobody fully understood yet was that GHB wasn't just dangerous when you took too much. It was dangerous because you could never really know how much was too much. Every batch was different. Every body metabolized it differently. And when you combined it with the heat, the dehydration, the physical exertion of dancing for hours, and the other drugs people were inevitably mixing it with, you were creating a perfect storm of physiological chaos. GHB didn't just tag along to the rave scene. It infiltrated it, seduced it, and then started quietly, methodically, killing it from the inside out. If you've never tasted GHB, congratulations, you've dodged a sensory nightmare. If you have, you're probably wincing right now. GHB is legendarily disgusting. Imagine licking a handful of sea salt, then gargling with soapy water, then adding a faint chemical aftertaste that clings to your tongue like a bad decision. It's salty, bitter, yet vaguely soapy, and absolutely unforgettable in the worst possible way. Some people described it as tasting like the ocean mixed with battery acid. Others said it was like drinking sadness. Either way, nobody was sipping GHB for the flavour. At raves, people would try to mask the taste by mixing it into energy drinks, orange juice or vodka, which only made things worse because now you had a terrible tasting cocktail that could also knock you out cold. The smart ones chased it with something sweet, pinched their nose and hoped for the best. The brave ones just threw it back like a shot and tried not to gag. But the taste was actually a feature, not a bug, at least at first, because GHB tasted so bad, it was hard to slip into someone's drink unnoticed. You'd know if your soda suddenly tasted like you were drinking from a tidal pool. That was supposed to be a safety mechanism, supposed to be. But as we'll see later, predators found ways around it, and the taste that was meant to protect people became just another cruel detail in a much darker story. The salty taste came from the sodium content. Chemically, GHB is often sold as sodium oxybate or sodium gamma hydroxybutyrate, which means it's loaded with salt. Not the pleasant, savoury salt of potato chips, but the harsh, mineral salt of ocean water or Epsom salts. It's the kind of taste that makes your face involuntarily contort, your eyes water, and your body instinctively reject what you're putting in your mouth. First-time users were almost always shocked by the taste. They'd hear about GHB, hear about the high, hear that it was amazing, and then someone would hand them a bottle cap full of clear liquid. They'd throw it back, expecting it to taste like water or maybe slightly medicinal, and then their taste buds would revolt. The immediate response was usually a grimace, a shudder, and a desperate reach for something, anything, to wash away the taste. Veteran users would laugh and say, "Yeah, it's awful, but you get used to it." Except you never really got used to it. You just learned to tolerate it, to dissociate from the experience, to think about the high that was coming instead of the horror currently happening in your mouth. Some people tried to get creative with masking the flavour. Mixing it into Red Bull was common. The sweetness and carbonation helped a little, though not much. Others would mix it into orange juice, pineapple juice, or even chocolate milk. One particularly misguided individual claimed that mixing it with pickle juice made it better. It did not. Nothing made it better. The taste was just part of the deal, a hazing ritual you had to endure to get to the high on the other side. The taste also became a point of dark humour in the rave scene. People would joke about it, compete over who could take it without making a face, create elaborate drinking games around it. If you can take a capful without chasing it, you're hardcore. It was stupid, reckless, and very much in line with the bravado that defined that era. Nobody wanted to be the person who couldn't handle the taste, who needed a chaser, who gagged and spit it out. So people forced it down, even when every instinct in their body was screaming to reject it. But here's where the taste paradox becomes tragic. That terrible flavour should have been a warning sign. Your body was telling you, this is not food. This is not safe. Stop putting this in your mouth. And people ignored it. They overrode their own biological alarm system in pursuit of a high. And because humans are stubborn, competitive, and often self-destructive, especially in group settings, they kept doing it. Week after week, rave after rave, bottle cap after bottle cap. The taste also had a practical downside. It made people sloppy with their dosing. Because taking GHB was so unpleasant, people wanted to get it over with quickly. They'd pour a dose, throw it back fast, and not pay attention to how much they'd actually consumed. They'd just want it down their throat and gone, chased with whatever was handy, and followed by immediate regret and a prayer that the high would be worth it. And for predators, the taste was both an obstacle and an opportunity. Yes, it was hard to slip GHB into someone's drink unnoticed, but if you could mask it in something strongly flavoured, a margarita, a Long Island iced tea, an energy drink cocktail, and if the victim was already a few drinks in and not paying close attention, you could get away with it. The taste would register as off, but not necessarily as I've been drugged. Maybe just as this bar makes bad drinks or this mixer is expired. By the time the victim realised something was seriously wrong, it was too late. The drug was already in their system, already working its way through their bloodstream, already shutting down their ability to think clearly, move normally, or call for help. So the taste that was supposed to protect people became just another layer of the tragedy. It was awful enough to deter some, but not awful enough to stop the determined, the desperate, or the predatory. And in the end, that terrible, salty, soapy flavour became one of the most memorable sensory experiences of an entire generation of ravers, not because they enjoyed it, but because it was the last thing they tasted before everything went wrong. So why did people keep drinking this salty nightmare fuel despite the taste? Because when GHB worked, it really worked. The high was unique, different from ecstasy's empathogenic rush, different from alcohol's sloppy buzz, different from weed's hazy calm. GHB felt like melting. Your body would relax completely, like every muscle you'd been tensing your entire life suddenly let go. Your mind would quiet down, but not in a foggy, drunken way, more like someone had turned down the volume on your anxiety and insecurity and left you with just pure, warm contentment. People described feeling sensual, confident, and deeply connected to their bodies. Dancing became effortless, conversations flowed naturally, and the music seemed to pulse through you like it was coming from inside your chest. Unlike ecstasy, which could leave you jittery and overstimulated, GHB had this languid, dreamy quality. You weren't bouncing off the walls, you were floating through them. And because it enhanced physical sensations, it became notorious for making everything feel more intense, more intimate, more real. For a few hours, it felt like you'd unlocked a secret level of existence where everything was softer, warmer, and just a little bit magical. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. That perfect high only happened if you nailed the dose. Too little and you'd feel nothing. Too much and you'd wake up in a hospital. Or worse, not wake up at all. And because GHB was often homemade, unregulated, and measured with bottle caps instead of syringes, nailing that dose was like playing Russian roulette with a chemistry set. The physical sensations of a GHB high were what kept people coming back despite the risks. It started subtly, a warmth spreading from your chest outward, a loosening of tension you didn't even know you were holding. Your shoulders would drop. Your jaw, probably clenched from dancing or stress, would finally relax. Your breathing would deepen and slow, and with it, the racing thoughts that usually cluttered your mind would fade into the background. Then came the euphoria. Not the manic electric euphoria of stimulants, but something gentler and more profound. It felt like being wrapped in the world's softest blanket while simultaneously weightless. People described it as a full-body warmth, a sense of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. In the context of a rave, with the bass vibrating through the floor and lights swirling overhead, this feeling was transcendent. Music sounded better on GHB, not just louder or clearer, but emotionally resonant in a way that was hard to articulate. The bass would hit your chest, and you'd feel it not just physically but spiritually, like the music was speaking directly to something deep inside you. Or melodies would bring tears to your eyes for no reason you could explain. And when you danced, you weren't just moving your body, you were channeling the music through yourself, becoming part of the rhythm, part of the collective energy of the room. The social effects were powerful too. GHB lowered inhibitions without making you sloppy or incoherent the way alcohol did. You'd feel confident enough to talk to strangers, to dance without self-consciousness, to express yourself freely. But unlike ecstasy, which made you want to connect with everyone around you, GHB's social effects were more selective. You'd bond deeply with the people you were already close to, have long, meaningful conversations, feel this profound sense of intimacy and understanding, and then there was the sensual aspect. Sex. GHB dramatically enhanced physical touch and sensation. A hug felt like the best hug you'd ever received. Dancing with someone felt electric. For people in relationships, GHB became notorious for enhancing intimacy in ways that made it popular in certain circles despite the dangers. This property would later be exploited in the darkest possible ways, but in consensual contexts between trusted partners, it created experiences people described as intensely bonding. The high typically lasted 2 to 3 hours, with a gentle come-down that left you feeling relaxed and slightly dreamy. Unlike ecstasy, which could leave you depleted and depressed for days afterward, GHB's after effects were usually mild. You'd wake up the next day feeling more or less normal, maybe a little tired, but without the crushing emotional hangover that came with other drugs. This combination, powerful high, minimal hangover, relatively short duration, made GHB seem like the perfect party drug. You could take it at midnight, peak around 1 or 2 in the morning, and be mostly back to baseline by the time the rave ended at dawn. You didn't need to commit to being high all night like you did with acid or ecstasy. You could dip in, experience the magic, and dip back out. But the perfection was an illusion, because achieving that ideal high required perfect dosing, perfect circumstances, and perfect luck. And in the chaos of the rave scene, with varying batch strengths, varying individual tolerances, and the temptation to mix GHB with other substances, perfection was nearly impossible. For every person who had a magical experience with GHB, there was someone else who overdosed, blacked out, or worse. The high might have felt like floating, but the crash back to reality was often brutal, sudden, and sometimes fatal. The drug promised heaven but delivered it right next to the trapdoor to hell, and you never knew which one you'd get until you'd already committed. Let's talk about the single most dangerous thing about GHB. Nobody knew how much they were actually taking. Unlike prescription drugs with precise dosing and lab-tested purity, GHB at raves was a complete wild card. It came in unmarked bottles, passed hand to hand, with dosing instructions that were basically urban legends. Someone would say, "Oh, just take a capful," as if all bottle caps were the same size. Spoiler, they weren't. A cap from a water bottle held way more than a cap from a travel-size shampoo bottle. And since GHB's effective dose and its dangerous dose were separated by a razor-thin margin, sometimes just a milliliter or two, this guessing game was deadly. The difference between a fun night and a medical emergency could literally be one extra sip. To make things worse, GHB's concentration varied wildly depending on who made it and how it was diluted. Some batches were weak and watery, others were concentrated enough to drop you after a teaspoon. You never knew what you were getting. People would take what they thought was a normal dose based on their last experience, only to discover this batch was way stronger. And by the time they realized it, they were already going down, fast. Then there was the time delay. GHB didn't hit instantly like a shot of tequila. It took 15 to 30 minutes to kick in, sometimes longer if you'd eaten recently. Impatient ravers would take a dose, feel nothing, assume it was weak and take more. Then both doses would hit at once like a freight train. This phenomenon, called stacking, was responsible for countless overdoses, and because everyone's body chemistry is different, the same dose that made one person feel blissful could leave their friend unconscious on the bathroom floor. There were no instructions, no safety labels, no way to know if you were about to have the best night of your life or the worst. The dosing chaos started with measurement. In a medical setting, doses are measured precisely. Milligrams calculated based on body weight, dispensed with calibrated equipment, administered by trained professionals. At a rave, you had someone pouring liquid into random containers by eye, in the dark. While music pounded at 130 beats per minute, capful became the standard unit of measurement, which was insane because there was no standard cap. Water bottle caps, soda bottle caps, pill bottle caps, eye drop caps, all held different volumes. Then there was the concentration problem. Homemade GHB varied wildly in strength. One batch might be diluted to the point where a full cap did almost nothing. The next batch, from a different source, or even the same source using a slightly different recipe, might be concentrated enough that half a cap was an overdose. There was no labeling, no way to test it, no quality control whatsoever. You were literally rolling the dice every single time. Experienced users tried to develop strategies. Some would start with a tiny dose, just a few drops, wait to see how it hit, and then decide if they wanted more. This was smart in theory, but difficult in practice. In the chaotic environment of a rave, waiting patiently for 30 minutes to assess your first dose required discipline that most people, especially after a few drinks, didn't have. The music was pumping, everyone around you was high, and there was this social pressure to just go for it, to stop overthinking and commit. Other people developed elaborate rituals. They'd only buy from trusted sources, always test a new batch at home before bringing it to a rave, and measure doses using the same specific bottle cap every time. But even this wasn't foolproof. A trusted source could get a bad batch. A test at home, where you were relaxed and hydrated, might not reflect how the drug would hit in a hot, crowded warehouse after hours of dancing. And even with the same bottle cap, if the concentration changed, your safe dose became a gamble. Body weight and tolerance also played huge roles that most users didn't fully understand. A 120-pound woman and a 200-pound man should not take the same dose of any drug, but at raves, people shared without thinking about it. Here, try this much, it's perfect, was advice given without any consideration of individual physiology. And tolerance was a moving target. Someone who'd been using GHB regularly would need more to feel the same effects, but if they took a break and their tolerance dropped, their usual dose could suddenly be too much. The time delay was particularly treacherous. With alcohol, you feel it hit pretty quickly, same with smoking weed or taking most stimulants. Yeah, but GHB could take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour to peak, depending on stomach contents, individual metabolism, and the specific formulation. This delay created a false sense of security. People would take their dose and continue drinking, dancing, and socializing as if nothing had happened. Then, 30 minutes later, the drug would slam into them all at once, and they'd be completely unprepared for how hard it hit. Stacking, taking multiple doses because the first one seemed weak, was the most common cause of overdoses. Someone would take a capful at midnight, feel nothing by 12:30, take another capful, and then by 1 o'clock both doses would metabolize simultaneously, and their central nervous system would shut down. By the time they realized they'd taken too much, they were already unconscious. And mixing? Forget about it. People would take GHB on top of alcohol, on top of ecstasy, on top of whatever else they'd consumed that night. Each substance interacted with the others in unpredictable ways, amplifying effects, slowing metabolism, creating toxic combinations that turned a recreational dose into a lethal one. But in the moment, in the dark, with the music pounding and everyone around you experimenting, these risks seemed abstract, distant, like something that happened to other people but never to you. Until suddenly it did. One of the most terrifying things about GHB wasn't the high, it was the timing. You'd take a dose and then wait. 15 minutes, 20, 30, nothing. You'd start to wonder if it was bunk, if you got ripped off, if maybe you should just take a little more to be safe, and that's exactly when it would hit. Suddenly your body would go from 0 to weightless in the span of a few minutes. Your limbs would feel heavy and light at the same time, your vision would soften around the edges, and this warm, liquid relaxation would spread through your chest like someone had injected honey directly into your bloodstream. If you dosed correctly, this was bliss. But if you'd taken too much, or worse, doubled up because you thought the first dose wasn't working, this was the beginning of a nightmare. Your vision would blur, your legs would stop responding, words would get stuck in your throat. You'd try to tell your friends you didn't feel right, but by the time you opened your mouth, the world was already tilting sideways. The worst part? GHB overdoses didn't always look dramatic. People didn't convulse or scream, they just dropped. 1 second they'd be standing, dancing, talking, laughing. The next second they'd be slumped against the wall or curled up on the floor, completely unresponsive. And in a rave, where half the crowd looked half dead anyway from exhaustion and other drugs, it was easy to miss. Friends would assume you were just sleeping it off. Bouncers would assume you were drunk. Nobody would realize you'd crossed the line from intoxicated to overdosing until it was almost too late. And if nobody noticed in time, your brain would forget to tell your lungs to keep breathing, and that was it. Game over. The 30-minute window created a perfect storm of bad decision-making. In those first 20 to 30 minutes after dosing, you felt completely sober. You'd be talking to friends, maybe having another drink, dancing, feeling totally normal. There was no indication that anything was happening inside your body. But on a cellular level, the GHB was being absorbed through your stomach lining, entering your bloodstream, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and beginning to bind to GABA receptors in your central nervous system. During this window, people made their most dangerous mistakes. They'd think, I don't feel anything, this must be weak, and take more. Or they'd think, I'm fine, I'll just have one more beer, not realizing they were about to stack a depressant on top of a depressant. Or they'd accept another substance from someone, a hit of ecstasy, a bump of ketamine, creating a drug cocktail that would hit them all at once when the GHB finally kicked in. When it did hit, the transition was shockingly abrupt. One moment you were sober, the next moment you were deeply intoxicated. There was no gradual climb, no gentle onset. It was like falling off a cliff. Your motor control would vanish, your speech would slur, your vision would double, and if you'd taken too much, your consciousness would start to flicker like a light bulb on its last legs. For people who dosed correctly, this sudden onset was manageable, even pleasant. They'd sit down, lean against a wall, let the high wash over them, and ride it out. But for people who'd overdosed, panic would set in immediately. They'd realise in those last few seconds of clarity that something was seriously wrong. Their body wasn't responding the way it should. Their heart was racing or slowing down too much. Their breathing felt laboured, and they'd try to get help, try to find a friend, try to make it to somewhere safe. But GHB doesn't give you time. Within minutes of realising you're in trouble, you'd be too impaired to do anything about it. The visual cues of a GHB overdose were subtle, which made them deadly. Unlike someone overdosing on stimulants, who might be sweating, shaking, and obviously in distress, someone overdosing on GHB would just look sleepy. They'd be slumped over, eyes closed, breathing slowly. To an untrained observer, they looked like someone who'd had too much to drink and needed to sleep it off. But that slow breathing was the warning sign. GHB overdoses suppress respiratory function. Each breath becomes shallower, further apart, and if nobody intervened, those breaths would eventually stop altogether. Friends often missed these warning signs because they assumed their friend was just really high or really drunk. They'd prop them up in a corner, put a bottle of water next to them, and go back to dancing, checking in occasionally to make sure they were still there. What they didn't realise was that their friend wasn't sleeping it off, they were slowly suffocating. By the time someone finally realised this wasn't normal sleep, that the person wasn't waking up when shaken or shouted at, precious minutes or even hours had been lost. The window also created a false sense of security for repeat users. Someone who'd used GHB before without incident would think, I know how this works, I know my limits. They'd take their usual dose and assume they'd be fine because they'd been fine before. But GHB doesn't work like that. Variables change constantly. Batch strength, stomach contents, hydration levels, recent alcohol consumption. Even ambient temperature could affect how the drug hit you. What was safe last week could be lethal this week, and you wouldn't know until you were already too far gone to do anything about it. The 30-minute window wasn't just a pharmacological quirk, it was a death trap engineered by the drug's chemistry. It punished impatience, rewarded caution that most people didn't have, and created a scenario where by the time you realised you'd made a mistake, it was often too late to undo it. Every dose was a delayed reaction bomb, and you never knew if you'd set the timer too short until it went off. GHB overdoses weren't like overdoses from other drugs. There was no gradual decline, no clear warning signs you could catch if you were paying attention. You'd be fine, and then you weren't. It happened fast, terrifyingly fast. 1 minute you'd be dancing, laughing, lost in the music. The next minute you'd be on the ground, non-responsive, your body limp as a rag doll. Friends would shake you, shout your name, pour water on your face. Nothing. You were out cold, deeper than sleep, deeper than drunk, gone. And the scariest part? Sometimes you'd look fine. Your chest would still be rising and falling, your heart still beating. You just wouldn't wake up. So people would drag you to a couch, prop you up in a corner, and assume you'd sleep it off. They'll be fine in an hour. Except sometimes they weren't. Because GHB doesn't just make you unconscious, it suppresses your central nervous system. Your breathing slows. Your gag reflex shuts down. If you vomit while you're out, and many people did, you could choke on it without ever waking up. And if nobody noticed in time, your brain would quietly suffocate while your body lay there motionless, looking almost peaceful. The emergency room doctors called it GHB coma, and by the mid-90s, they were seeing it almost every weekend. Patients would arrive unconscious, unresponsive, sometimes barely breathing. The doctors would run tests, pump stomachs, hook them up to IVs, and wait. Most of the time, the person would wake up a few hours later, confused and disoriented, with no memory of what had happened. But sometimes they didn't wake up, and that was the nightmare, a drug that promised euphoria but delivered oblivion. The transition from conscious to unconscious happened so fast that witnesses often struggled to describe it. One moment the person would be vertical, engaged, present. The next moment they'd crumple, as if someone had cut their strings. There was no stumbling, no gradual slumping, just instant collapse. Sometimes they'd manage to sit down first, slumped against a wall with their head lolling forward. Other times they'd drop mid-conversation, mid-dance move, mid-step, hitting the floor hard enough to injure themselves on the way down. The unconscious state itself was disturbing to witness. The person's body would go completely limp, muscles relaxed to the point where they looked boneless. Their face would be slack, expressionless. Their eyes might be half open but unseeing or fully closed. Their skin would often look pale or greyish. And their breathing, that was the truly terrifying part. Each breath would be shallow, irregular, sometimes separated by long pauses that made bystanders wonder if the next breath would come at all. Our friends and fellow ravers, most of them young and with no medical training, would panic. Should they call an ambulance? In the rave scene of the 90s, calling for help was complicated. Many raves were illegal, held in warehouses without permits. Calling the cops or paramedics meant potentially shutting down the party, getting arrested, or facing legal consequences. So people hesitated. They'd try to wake the person up first, shaking them, yelling at them, slapping their face, pouring water on them. When that didn't work, they'd confer nervously with each other. Has this happened to them before? What did they take? Should we wait a little longer? This delay between the collapse and the emergency call cost lives. Every minute that ticked by without proper medical intervention was a minute of potential brain damage from oxygen deprivation. But scared kids at a rave didn't know that. They'd been taught to avoid police, to handle their problems internally, to not snitch. And tragically, that cultural conditioning meant people literally died, while their friends stood around debating whether calling for help would get everyone in trouble. When ambulances finally did arrive, the scene was always chaotic. Paramedics would push through crowds of high, disoriented partygoers to reach the patient. They'd ask questions no one could answer. What did they take? How much? When? The friends would shrug, panic-stricken. I don't know. Maybe GHB? Maybe something else? They had some drinks too, I think. The lack of information made treatment harder and risks higher. The ride to the hospital was a race against time. Paramedics would monitor vitals, administer oxygen, try to keep the patient stable. In severe cases, they'd have to intubate, insert a breathing tube, because the person's respiratory drive had been suppressed to the point where they could no longer breathe adequately on their own. It was invasive, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous, but necessary to keep the person alive. At the ER, the unconscious patient would be stripped, examined, hooked up to monitors, and treated symptomatically because there was no specific antidote for GHB. Doctors couldn't reverse the overdose like they could with opioids and Narcan. All they could do was support the body's vital functions and wait for the drug to metabolize. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, as everything was monitored constantly. If the patient vomited, medical staff had to suction out the airway to prevent aspiration. If breathing became too compromised, a ventilator was necessary. And then they waited, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 6, sometimes for 12. GHB metabolized relatively quickly, but in overdose quantities, especially when mixed with alcohol or other drugs, it could take far longer to clear the system. During that time, the patient remained in a coma-like state, utterly unresponsive, their life hanging in the balance while machines breathed for them and doctors hoped they hadn't been without oxygen for too long. When patients finally woke up, the confusion was profound. They had opened their eyes to fluorescent hospital lights, with tubes in their arms and oxygen masks on their faces, surrounded by worried medical staff and sometimes police. They'd have no memory of the past several hours, no memory of collapsing, being carried out, riding in an ambulance or being treated. Just a blank space where their life should have been. And when the doctors explained what happened, many patients struggled to believe it. I was just having fun. I took a little bit. How did I end up here? But the monitors, the bruises from the IV lines, and the terrified faces of their friends told the story their missing memories couldn't. If taking GHB alone was risky, mixing it with alcohol was like playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. Both substances are central nervous system depressants, meaning they slow down your brain's ability to control essential functions like breathing and heart rate. When you combine them, they don't just add together, they multiply. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it equals 4, 5, sometimes 10. Your body, already struggling to metabolize the alcohol, now has to deal with GHB on top of it, and it can't. People would have a few drinks at a rave, feel loose and confident, and then someone would offer them GHB. They'd think, I'm not that drunk, I'll be fine. And then they'd take a dose, and within minutes, their body would shut down. The alcohol amplified the GHB's effects exponentially, and the GHB amplified the alcohol's effects right back. It was a chemical feedback loop of disaster. Breathing would slow to a crawl, blood pressure would drop, core body temperature would plummet, and all of this would happen while the person looked like they were just really, really drunk. Friends wouldn't realize it was a medical emergency until it was too late. Emergency rooms started seeing cases where patients would come in appearing mildly intoxicated, only to crash hard hours later as the combined effects caught up with them. Some people died not from the initial overdose but from the delayed respiratory failure that happened when both substances peaked in their system at the same time. And the cruelest part? The person who took the GHB often had no idea they were in danger. They'd feel the initial rush, think everything was fine, and then slip into unconsciousness without ever realizing they'd just made a fatal mistake. The pharmacology of why alcohol and GHB are so dangerous together is straightforward but deadly. Both substances work by enhancing the activity of GABA, a neurotransmitter that inhibits brain activity. GABA is your brain's brake pedal. It slows things down, creates calm, reduces anxiety. A little bit of GABA enhancement is relaxing. Too much, and your brain can't perform basic life-sustaining functions. When you drink alcohol, your GABA receptors become more active, creating that familiar buzz. When you add GHB, which also acts on GABA receptors, you're essentially pressing the brake pedal and then placing a cement block on top of it. Your brain's activity slows to a dangerous crawl. The effects are synergistic, not just additive. If alcohol alone gives you a sedation level of 3 and GHB alone gives you a 5, combining them doesn't give you an 8, it gives you a 15. The math doesn't work linearly because each substance makes the other more potent. Alcohol slows the metabolism of GHB, meaning it stays in your system longer and hits harder. GHB amplifies alcohol's depressant effects, meaning you feel far drunker than your blood alcohol level would suggest. In the rave scene, mixing was almost inevitable. People would start the night with a few drinks at home or during the car ride over. By the time they arrived at the venue, they had a comfortable buzz going. Then, an hour or two into the night, someone would offer GHB. The alcohol had lowered their inhibitions, made them feel more confident and willing to experiment. They'd take the GHB without even thinking about the drinks they'd had earlier, because those drinks had been hours ago and they didn't feel drunk anymore. But the alcohol was still there, still in their bloodstream, still working on their system, and when the GHB hit, it was like dropping a match into a room full of gasoline. The combined effect was immediate and devastating. People would go from talking and laughing to unconscious in less than 10 minutes. Their friends would be confused. They only had a few drinks and one dose of GHB that shouldn't be enough to knock them out, not realizing the combination had created something far more dangerous than either substance alone. The breathing suppression was particularly deadly. Both alcohol and GHB tell your brainstem to slow down respiratory function. Your brainstem usually operates automatically, keeping you breathing even when you're asleep or unconscious. But when it's being suppressed by two powerful depressants at once, it starts to fail. Breaths become shallower, further apart, less effective at oxygenating your blood. And because you're unconscious, you have no ability to recognize the problem or force yourself to breathe deeper. People who mixed alcohol and GHB would sometimes stop breathing entirely for periods of time, a condition called apnea. Their body would go 30, 40, even 60 seconds without taking a breath. If they were alone, that could be fatal. If they were with friends who were also high and not paying attention, it could still be fatal. Only if someone noticed immediately and called for help, and if paramedics arrived in time would the person survive. Core body temperature regulation also failed. Both substances interfere with your hypothalamus, the part of your brain that maintains your body temperature. People who overdosed on alcohol and GHB would become hypothermic, even in crowded, warm venues. Their skin would feel clammy and cold to the touch. Their lips might turn blue, and because they were unconscious, they couldn't shiver or move to generate heat. They'd just lie there, cooling down, while their friends piled jackets on them and wondered why they weren't waking up. The gag reflex suppression was another killer. When you vomit while deeply unconscious, and many people who mixed alcohol and GHB did, you have no ability to clear your airway. The vomit would pool in your mouth and throat, blocking airflow. In medical terms, this is called aspiration, and it leads to suffocation or severe pneumonia if the person survives. Many deaths attributed to alcohol poisoning in the 90s were actually mixed overdoses where GHB was the unseen culprit. Emergency room staff became grimly familiar with the presentation. A young person would come in unconscious, reeking of alcohol, with friends saying they'd just had too much to drink. The doctors would run the standard protocols for alcohol poisoning, IV fluids, monitoring, time, but the patient wouldn't respond as expected. They'd stay unconscious far too long. Their breathing would remain dangerously slow, and their vital signs would be unstable in ways that didn't match a simple alcohol overdose. Eventually, someone would mention GHB, or the tox screen would come back showing trace amounts, and the doctors would realize they were dealing with something far more complicated and dangerous. The tragic irony was that most people who mixed alcohol and GHB genuinely didn't know they were taking such a massive risk. There were no warning labels, no PSA campaigns explicitly about the dangers of mixing. People just assumed that if they could handle their alcohol, and if one dose of GHB was safe on its own, combining them would be fine. They didn't understand pharmacology or synergistic effects. They just wanted to have a good time. and that lack of knowledge killed them. Here's one of the most disturbing things about GHB. Even if you survived an overdose, you'd have no memory of it. GHB causes something called anterograde amnesia, which means your brain stops forming new memories while you're under its influence. So you take a dose, blackout, get rushed to the hospital, have your stomach pumped, get hooked up to machines, wake up hours later in a hospital gown, and remember absolutely nothing. Friends would tell you stories the next day about how they found you collapsed in the bathroom, how the paramedics had to carry you out on a stretcher, how you'd stopped breathing and they'd had to resuscitate you, and you'd sit there, completely blank, with zero recollection of any of it. To you, it was like you'd just teleported from the rave to the hospital. This amnesia made GHB especially dangerous because people couldn't learn from their mistakes. You'd overdose, wake up with no memory of how bad it got and think, well, I survived, so it couldn't have been that serious. And then a week later, you'd do it again. The missing hours also created legal nightmares. People would wake up in jail with no memory of being arrested. They'd have injuries they couldn't explain, bruises and cuts from falls they didn't remember taking. Some would wake up in strangers' beds with no memory of how they got there or what had happened in between. It was like losing chunks of your life to a black hole, and you'd never get them back. The doctors, nurses and paramedics who dealt with GHB cases saw this over and over. Patients who'd been on death's door just hours earlier, now awake and confused, asking what happened, why they were there, insisting they felt fine. And the medical staff would have to explain, gently, patiently, that no, you weren't fine. You almost died, and you need to stop. The amnesia wasn't just a side effect. It was a defining characteristic of GHB that made it uniquely dangerous from both a medical and psychological perspective. When someone overdosed on most drugs, they remembered the experience. They remembered the fear, the loss of control, the terrifying moment when they realized something was seriously wrong. That memory often served as a powerful deterrent against future use. But with GHB, there was no memory to learn from, just a blank space where several hours of your life used to be. Patients would wake up in the emergency room, groggy and disoriented, with no idea where they were or how they got there. They'd look around at the monitors beeping beside them, the IV line in their arm, the hospital gown they didn't remember putting on, and feel a surge of panic. Medical staff would approach calmly, explaining that they'd been brought in unconscious, that they'd overdosed, that they were lucky to be alive. And the patient would shake their head, insisting there must be some mistake. I only had a little bit. I was fine. I was just dancing. But they weren't fine. Their medical chart told a different story. A respiratory rate of 6 breaths per minute when they arrived. Blood oxygen saturation in the 80s. Unresponsive to pain stimuli. Pupils pinpoint. The classic signs of a severe CNS depressant overdose. The medical team had fought to stabilize them, to keep them breathing, to prevent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. It had been touch and go for a while, but the patient remembered none of it. Friends and family members who'd been at the hospital during the ordeal would try to explain. You weren't breathing right. You wouldn't wake up. We thought you were going to die. And the patient would listen, trying to absorb this information about an experience they couldn't recall, feeling like they were hearing about someone else's life, not their own. The amnesia created a dangerous disconnect between cause and effect. In normal circumstances, if you do something that nearly kills you, your brain encodes that as a powerful visceral warning. Don't do that again. But with GHB there was no visceral warning. Just a gap in time and people telling you that bad things happened. It was abstract, intellectual, easy to minimize or rationalize. Yeah, but I'm fine now became a common refrain. This made it almost impossible for people to accurately assess their own relationship with the drug. Someone could overdose 3, 4, 5 times and still insist they knew how to use it safely, because they had no memory of the overdoses themselves. Each time they'd wake up feeling mostly okay, minus some grogginess and confusion, and conclude that whatever happened hadn't been that serious. The lack of memory created a false sense of safety. The amnesia also had profound psychological effects. Some people became paranoid, wondering what they'd done or said during the missing hours. Others experienced a disturbing sense of lost time, feeling violated by their own inability to remember. And for those who'd been sexually assaulted while unconscious under the influence of GHB, the amnesia was devastating. They'd wake up knowing something terrible had happened but unable to remember any details, unable to identify their attacker, unable even to fully process their own trauma. Medical staff found it frustrating because they couldn't rely on patient self-reporting. A patient might insist they'd only taken a capful when witnesses said they'd seen them taking multiple doses throughout the night. The patient genuinely believed their own account because they remembered taking one dose and then nothing else. The subsequent doses happened during the amnesia window and were completely erased from their memory. The legal implications were significant too. People would be arrested for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, or more serious offences committed while under the influence, and have absolutely no memory of what they'd done. They'd wake up in a jail cell charged with crimes they couldn't recall committing, unable to mount any kind of defence because they couldn't remember the events in question. Some lost jobs, relationships, or legal standing over actions they took while experiencing drug-induced amnesia. Perhaps most tragically, the amnesia meant that people who died from GHB overdoses never knew what was happening. They'd be unconscious before they could process the danger. In a way, it was merciful, no prolonged fear or suffering. But for the loved ones left behind, there was something particularly cruel about knowing that the person's last conscious moment was probably one of happiness, thinking everything was fine, dancing to music they loved, having no idea they were about to stop breathing and never wake up. The medical community struggled with how to address the amnesia issue in harm reduction messaging. How do you warn people about consequences they won't remember experiencing? How do you make them understand that I survived, so it must not have been that bad? Is fundamentally flawed logic when they can't remember how close they came to dying. In the end, the amnesia became yet another reason why GHB was so insidious, so dangerous, and so difficult to combat. It erased its own evidence, made learning impossible, and left people vulnerable to repeating the same deadly mistakes over and over without ever truly understanding the risks they were taking. Up until now, we've been talking about GHB as a drug people took willingly for fun to get high. But there's a much darker chapter to this story, one that turned GHB from a party drug into a predator's tool. Because GHB had a few properties that made it perfect for people with the worst possible intentions. It was colourless, nearly odourless, unless you knew what to smell for. It dissolved quickly in liquid, and most importantly, it caused amnesia. By the mid-90s, reports started surfacing of people, mostly women, waking up with no memory of the previous night, feeling disoriented, violated, and terrified. They'd been at a bar, at a party, at a club. They'd had a drink or two, nothing crazy, and then nothing. Just a blank space where hours should have been. And sometimes, horrifyingly, they'd wake up with physical evidence that something had happened to them while they were unconscious. GHB became known as a date rape drug, a term that sounds clinical but hides an unspeakable horror. Predators would slip it into someone's drink when they weren't looking. Vodka sodas, cocktails, even bottled beer if the cap had been removed and replaced. The victim would feel the effects within minutes. Sudden dizziness, confusion, loss of motor control. They'd try to tell their friends something was wrong, but the words wouldn't come out right. And then they'd be gone, physically present but mentally absent. And whoever had drugged them would lead them away, out of the bar, into a car, into a nightmare. The amnesia meant that even if the victim survived, They often couldn't remember their attacker's face, what had been done to them, or how they'd ended up where they woke up. And that made prosecuting these crimes nearly impossible. There was no evidence, no testimony, no memory, just a sickening, empty feeling and the knowledge that something terrible had happened. This wasn't a side effect of the rave scene. This was something much worse. GHB had become a tool of violence. The transformation of GHB from party drug to predator's weapon didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, insidious, and devastating in its effectiveness. Predators, always looking for methods to incapacitate victims, has discovered that GHB checked every box on their horrific wish list. It was easy to obtain, either through legal supplement stores in the early days or through underground sources later. It was relatively cheap compared to other drugs, and most importantly, it came with built-in evidence destruction through amnesia. The mechanics of how predators used GHB were chillingly calculated. They'd scout locations, bars, clubs, parties, anywhere people were drinking and socializing in dimly lit environments where attention was divided. They'd identify targets, usually women who were alone or separated from their group, who appeared trusting, who weren't watching their drinks carefully. Then they'd wait for the right moment when the target went to the bathroom, got distracted by conversation, or left their drink on the bar while dancing. The actual drugging took seconds. A small bottle that looked like eye drops, a quick pour into the unattended drink, a casual stir with a finger or straw to help it dissolve, and it was done. By the time the victim returned and took her next sip, the trap was set. Within 15 to 30 minutes, she'd start feeling the effects: sudden, overwhelming dizziness, difficulty standing, confusion, an inability to think clearly or speak properly. Her friends might notice and assume she was drunk, that she'd had more than she said, that she just needed to sit down for a minute. This is where predators often played the role of concerned friend or helpful stranger. They'd approach, offer assistance, say they'd help get the victim home safely or to a quiet place to rest. Or sometimes they'd even convince the victim's actual friends to let them take over, presenting themselves as responsible and trustworthy. And then they'd lead the victim away, out a side door, into a parking lot, into a vehicle. By this point the victim was barely conscious, unable to resist, unable to call for help, unable to do anything but be moved like a puppet. What happened next is almost too horrible to describe in detail, but it needs to be said. Predators would assault victims who were completely unconscious, unable to consent, unable to defend themselves, unable even to form memories of what was being done to them. It was violence in its purest, most cowardly form, targeting people who had no ability to fight back. When victims woke up, the horror compounded. They'd find themselves in unfamiliar locations, sometimes their own homes with no memory of how they got there, sometimes strangers' apartments, sometimes parking lots or alleys. Their clothing would be dishevelled or missing. They'd feel physically wrong, sore, bruised, violated, and they'd have no memory of how any of it happened. The psychological trauma was immense. Not only had they been assaulted, but they couldn't remember the assault itself. This created a unique kind of torment, knowing something terrible had happened but being unable to access the memory, unable to understand the full scope of what had been done to them. Some victims experienced intense anxiety, PTSD, intrusive thoughts about what might have occurred during those missing hours. Others felt a disturbing disconnect, like it hadn't really happened to them because they couldn't remember it. Like reporting these crimes was extraordinarily difficult. Victims would go to the police trying to explain what they thought had happened. But without memory, without clear evidence, without witnesses, the cases were nearly impossible to investigate. Police would ask questions victims couldn't answer. What did your attacker look like? Where were you when it happened? What time did this occur? And the victim would have to say, over and over, I don't know. "I don't remember. I can't tell you." Even when victims went to the hospital immediately, evidence collection was challenging. By the time they realised they needed to be tested, GHB had often already metabolized out of their system. Rape kits could document physical evidence of assault, but proving the assault was facilitated by drugs was much harder. And without proof of drugging, his defense attorneys could argue consent, could suggest the victim had simply drunk too much and regretted their choices, could paint the assault as a misunderstanding rather than a crime. Predators knew this. They understood that GHB gave them plausible deniability. Even if caught, they could claim the victim had taken the drug willingly, that the sex was consensual, that any memory problems were the victim's own fault for using drugs. The legal system, built on evidence and testimony, struggled to handle cases where the key witness couldn't remember the crime committed against them. The scope of GHB-facilitated sexual assault is difficult to quantify because so many cases went unreported or uninvestigated. But sexual assault crisis centres, hospital emergency rooms, and rape crisis hotlines all saw the same pattern throughout the mid to late 90s. Increasing numbers of people, primarily women, reporting suspected drugging followed by assault. The stories were eerily similar. The drink left unattended, the sudden onset of symptoms that felt different from normal alcohol intoxication, the memory gap, the waking up in distress. Women started changing their behaviour in response. Never leave your drink unattended became a mantra. Always watch the bartender make your drink. Use drink covers. Go to the bathroom in groups so someone can watch your drink while you're gone. Hold your hand over the top of your glass when you're not drinking from it. These strategies helped to some degree, but they also placed the burden of prevention on potential victims rather than on the predators themselves. And the reality was stark and enraging. GHB had given sexual predators a nearly perfect weapon, a chemical that incapacitated victims, prevented resistance, erased memory, and vanished from the body before evidence could be collected. It turned assault into a crime with no witness, including the victim themselves. And for years, while law enforcement, hospitals and communities struggled to respond, predators used it with horrifying frequency and near total impunity. After the date rape cases started making headlines, safety campaigns began circulating in clubs and bars. Watch your drink. Don't accept drinks from strangers. If your drink tastes weird, spit it out. That last part was crucial because GHB's salty, soapy taste was sometimes the only warning sign you'd get. But here's the problem. Not everyone noticed. If you were drinking something strongly flavoured, a rum and coke, a vodka cranberry, a sugary energy drink, the taste of GHB could get lost in the mix. Or maybe you'd taste something off but assume it was just a bad batch of mixer or cheap liquor. By the time you realised something was seriously wrong, it was too late. The drug was already in your system, already spreading through your bloodstream, already shutting down your brain. Some venues started handing out drink testing kits, little strips you could dip into your glass that would change colour if certain drugs were detected. But GHB didn't always register on those tests, especially if it was diluted. And even if you had a test strip, would you really use it every single time someone handed you a drink? At a crowded rave or bar where you'd had 3 or 4 drinks already, and the music was pounding and everyone around you seemed fine? Probably not. The cruel irony was that the taste that made GHB so unpleasant to take willingly also meant that victims often knew something was wrong, but only for a few seconds. They'd take a sip, grimace, think that's weird, and then the lights would start to dim. And by the time they tried to say something, tried to get help, the drug had already taken their voice, their balance, their memory, and their ability to fight back. The taste test could save your life, but only if you recognized it in time. And most people didn't. The taste recognition problem was more complex than it initially appeared. While GHB's salty chemical flavour was distinctive, recognising it required two things. First, actually noticing the taste amid whatever else was in your drink, and second, knowing that weird taste meant danger. In the early to mid-90s, before widespread awareness of GHB as a date rape drug, most people had never heard of it and wouldn't have known to be alarmed by an odd taste. The window of recognition was also brutally short. You'd take a sip, register that something tasted off, and then what? In a loud bar or club, you'd probably just make a face and take another sip, assuming the first taste was a fluke or that the bartender had made the drink poorly. By the second or third sip, you'd consumed enough GHB that your judgment was already beginning to impair. Your ability to recognise danger, to think clearly about what might be happening, was compromised within minutes of ingestion, with some victims later reported that they did taste something strange, described it as salty, soapy or chemical, but rationalised it away. Maybe this brand of vodka just tastes different. Maybe the tonic water is flat. Maybe they used tap water instead of filtered. These innocent explanations felt more plausible than someone has drugged me, especially in social settings where people generally trusted those around them. Drink composition played a huge role in whether GHB was detectable by taste. In clear, lightly flavoured drinks like gin and tonics or vodka sodas, GHB was more noticeable. The salty taste would stand out against the relatively clean flavour profile. But in drinks with strong, complex flavours, mojitos with muddled mint, margaritas with lime and salt, Long Island iced teas with multiple liquors, or energy drink cocktails, GHB could hide almost completely. The other flavours would mask it, and if you did taste something strange, you would attribute it to one of the other ingredients. Carbonation also helped disguise GHB. In drinks like rum and coke or vodka Red Bull, the fizzy bubbles and strong flavours would overwhelm the taste buds, making it much harder to detect an adulterant. Predators learned this and specifically targeted people drinking carbonated cocktails because they knew the drugs would be harder to detect. The concentration of GHB also affected detectability. A small amount in a large drink might be nearly tasteless. A larger amount in a smaller drink would be more obvious. But predators couldn't always control the concentration perfectly. They were working quickly, in dark environments, trying not to be noticed. Sometimes they'd add too much, and the drink would taste noticeably wrong. Other times they'd add too little, and it wouldn't be enough to fully incapacitate the victim, which would raise its own problems for the predator, but might give the victim a chance to escape. Safety campaigns tried to educate people about what to do if they tasted something strange. If your drink tastes weird, even slightly off, don't finish it. Put it down immediately. Tell your friends. Leave the venue if necessary. But this advice assumed people would trust their instincts and be willing to abandon a drink they'd just paid for, potentially look paranoid or rude, and disrupt their evening over something that might be nothing. The social pressure to not overreact was significant, especially for women who had been socialized to be polite, to not make scenes, to give people the benefit of the doubt. A woman who tasted something odd in her drink faced a split-second decision: make a fuss and potentially be wrong, embarrass herself, be seen as paranoid or high maintenance, or say nothing and hope it's fine. Many chose the latter, to their devastating regret. Drink testing kits seemed like a technological solution, but they had limitations. The most common tests were designed to detect rohypnol and ketamine, other date rape drugs, but many didn't reliably detect GHB, especially in the concentrations typically used. The tests also required you to actually use them, which meant carrying them with you, remembering to test every drink, and being willing to do so publicly in a social setting. Some venues tried to implement broader safety measures. Bars and clubs started training staff to recognize signs of drugging. Patrons who suddenly seemed far more intoxicated than their drink count would suggest. who were disoriented or having trouble standing, who were being helped out by someone they didn't seem to know well. Bouncers were instructed to intervene in suspicious situations, but in crowded, chaotic nightlife environments, it was nearly impossible to monitor everyone. The drink-covering industry emerged, special lids and covers you could put on your glass to prevent anyone from spiking it while you weren't looking. These worked well for bottled drinks, but were impractical for cocktails, and they required forethought and paranoia that many people didn't have until after they'd already been victimized. Women developed informal safety protocols among friend groups. The buddy system meant never going anywhere alone, always having someone watching your drink, checking on each other regularly throughout the night. Some groups established code words, phrases that meant I don't feel safe or I need to leave now without explicitly saying so. These strategies saved lives, but they also meant women had to live in a constant state of vigilance, treating every social outing as a potential crime scene. The cruelest aspect of the taste test was that it created a false sense of security for some people. They'd think, as long as I taste my drink, I'll be able to tell if something's wrong. But taste alone wasn't reliable enough. The drug could be masked. Your judgment could be impaired before you realize danger. And even if you did taste something and put the drink down immediately, you might have already consumed enough to be affected. In the end, the taste test was one tool among many, helpful but not foolproof. It might save your life if conditions were right, if you were paying attention, if the concentration was high enough to be noticeable, if you trusted your instincts, if you acted immediately. But for too many victims, by the time they registered that something was wrong, the GHB had already started its terrible work, and the window for escape had already closed. By the late 90s, GHB's body count was stacking up. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed, law enforcement was scrambling, and finally, after years of warnings from doctors, activists, and terrified parents, the FDA decided to act. In 1990, GHB was banned from over-the-counter sale. No more health food stores selling it as a supplement. No more gym bros buying it in bulk. It was done, except it wasn't. Because banning legal sales didn't make GHB disappear, it just pushed it underground. And making something illegal in the middle of a thriving black market is like trying to stop a flood with a paper towel. GHB was easy to make, terrifyingly easy. The chemical precursors were readily available online or in industrial supply stores. The synthesis process was simple enough that anyone with a high school chemistry understanding and a decent kitchen could whip up a batch. And so they did. Home labs started popping up everywhere, churning out GHB by the gallon. The raves didn't stop, the demand didn't drop. The only thing that changed was that now, instead of buying a semi-regulated supplement from a store, people were buying mystery liquid from someone's garage. No labels. No consistency, no accountability. The FDA's ban inadvertently made GHB more dangerous because now there was zero quality control. At least when it was legal, manufacturers had some incentive to keep dosages consistent. Now, it was a complete free-for-all. One batch might be weak and harmless. The next might be strong enough to kill you, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. The government had finally taken action, but the damage was already done. GHB was out there, in the wild, and it wasn't going anywhere. The FDA's decision to ban GHB came after mounting pressure from multiple directions. Medical professionals were sounding alarms about the overdoses they were seeing every weekend. Poison control centers were documenting a sharp rise in GHB-related calls. Parents whose children had died or been seriously harmed were organizing, lobbying, and demanding action. Media coverage of date rape cases linked to GHB was creating public outcry. The government could no longer ignore the problem. In February 1990, the FDA declared GHB unsafe for use as a dietary supplement and made it illegal to sell it for human consumption. The reasoning was straightforward. GHB had a narrow therapeutic window, meaning the difference between an effective dose and a toxic dose was too small for unregulated use. The lack of standardization meant people were essentially experimenting with unknown quantities of a potent sedative, and the evidence of harm, overdoses, deaths, sexual assaults was overwhelming. The ban was supposed to solve the problem, remove the drug from stores, restrict access, and let the issue fade away. But the FDA had dramatically underestimated how entrenched GHB had become in certain subcultures, and how easy it was to produce outside of legitimate channels. Within months of the ban, underground production ramped up to fill the void left by legal suppliers. The chemistry of GHB synthesis is not particularly complex. You start with GBL, gamma-butyrolactone, or BD, 1,4-butanediol, both of which were still legal to purchase because they had legitimate industrial uses. Add a base like sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide, also readily available, and through a relatively simple chemical reaction, you'd produce GHB. The process could be done in a few hours with equipment you could buy at any hardware store. Online forums and early internet chat rooms became repositories of synthesis information. People shared recipes, troubleshooting tips and sourcing advice, where to buy GBL, best ratio of base to precursor, how to tell when the reaction is complete. This information spread rapidly through the rave community, among bodybuilders, and unfortunately, among predators looking for a steady supply of their chosen weapon. Home production had several major problems. First, quality control was non-existent. Amateur chemists didn't have access to analytical equipment to verify concentration or purity. They'd eyeball measurements, estimate completion of reactions, and bottle the results without any real understanding of what they'd created. This meant batches varied wildly in strength. What someone thought was a standard dose based on their previous experience might be twice as strong or half as weak depending on how that particular batch was made. Second, contamination was common. If the reaction wasn't completed properly, residual GBL or BD would remain in the final product. These precursors were even more dangerous than GHB itself because they took longer to metabolize, meaning their effects were delayed and prolonged. People would take what they thought was GHB, feel nothing for 30 to 60 minutes, take more assuming it was weak, and then have both doses convert to GHB simultaneously, with catastrophic results. Third, the synthesis process itself was dangerous. Working with strong bases like sodium hydroxide required care. Splashes could cause severe chemical burns. Reactions generated heat, and if not properly controlled, could boil over or even explode. Amateur chemists working in poorly ventilated spaces could be harmed by fumes. There were numerous reports of people being hospitalized not from taking GHB but from injuries sustained while making it. Law enforcement tried to crack down on home production. They'd raid suspected labs, arrest manufacturers, seize equipment and chemicals. But for every lab they shut down, several more would spring up. The barriers to entry were simply too low. Unlike methamphetamine or other drugs that required specialized knowledge, controlled precursors, and dangerous synthesis procedures, GHB production was accessible to almost anyone willing to try. The FDA ban also created a price increase that made GHB production more profitable. When it was legal and sold in stores, a bottle might cost $15 to $30. Once it was banned, street prices jumped to $50 or more for an equivalent amount. This profit margin attracted people who saw an easy money-making opportunity. Buy cheap precursors, synthesize GHB, sell it at a markup, repeat. Some manufacturers tried to maintain quality and safety in their illegal production. They'd carefully measure ingredients, test batches on themselves before selling, and build reputations as reliable sources. But many didn't care. They'd make whatever they could sell, cut it with other substances to increase volume, and lie about concentration to command higher prices. The black market also lacked any sort of product liability or accountability. If someone died from your batch when it was legal, There might be lawsuits, investigations, regulatory consequences. But once it was illegal, the manufacturer was already operating outside the law. One more death didn't change their legal status. They were already criminals. This removed any incentive to prioritize safety over profit. Interestingly, the FDA ban created a strange dual market. Above ground, in certain contexts, GHB precursors could still be sold legally, as long as they weren't explicitly marketed for human consumption. Companies would sell GBL as industrial solvent or wheel cleaner, with a wink and a nod to buyers who obviously intended to convert it to GHB. This created a grey market that existed alongside the fully black market of finished GHB. By the time the government realised that banning GHB without also controlling its precursors was ineffective, it was too late. The cat was out of the bag. Thousands of people knew how to make it. Demand remained high, and the infrastructure for illicit production was well established. The FDA had acted, but not strategically enough or comprehensively enough to actually solve the problem. They just changed its nature, arguably making it worse in the process. So who was making this stuff after it went underground? The answer might surprise you. Pretty much anyone. GHB synthesis didn't require a PhD in chemistry or access to some secret black market lab. All you needed was a few easily obtained chemicals, gamma-butyrolactone, GBL, or 1,4-butanediol, BD, which were sold legally as industrial solvents, and something acidic or basic to convert them. Mix it in the right proportions, let it sit, and boom, you had GHB. People were making it in their kitchens, basements, and garages like they were brewing kombucha. Except instead of fermented tea, they were producing a controlled substance that could kill someone if the ratios were off by even a small margin. And those ratios, often wrong. Amateur chemists would find a recipe online, eyeball the measurements, skip steps they didn't understand, and then bottle the results in old Snapple bottles with handwritten labels. Sometimes they'd test it on themselves first, sometimes they wouldn't. Either way, the final product was a gamble. Some people became small-time dealers, selling GHB to friends or at raves, pocketing a few $100 a week. Others scaled up, producing gallons at a time, distributing it across entire cities. The profit margins were insane. Raw materials cost almost nothing, and a single batch could be sold for thousands. But the risks were just as high, if the fumes from the chemicals didn't poison you. The legal consequences might. And if someone died from your batch, you weren't just a dealer anymore, you were a killer. Law enforcement tried to crack down, raiding homes, seizing equipment, making arrests. But for every lab they shut down, 3 more popped up. Because GHB wasn't controlled by cartels or organized crime, it was democratized, decentralized. Anyone with an internet connection and $100 could become a manufacturer, and that made it almost impossible to stop. The profile of GHB manufacturers was surprisingly diverse. Some were bodybuilders who'd been using it legally for years and simply continued making their own supply after it was banned. They saw it as medicine, as a supplement, and didn't view themselves as criminals. They'd make batches for personal use and maybe share with gym buddies, not really considering themselves drug manufacturers. Others were ravers and club kids who'd started making GHB to supply their own social circles. It began innocently enough, one person learning how to make it to save money, then friends asking if they could buy some, then friends of friends, until suddenly this person was a dealer without really intending to become one. They'd tell themselves they were just helping people out, providing a service, keeping their community supplied with something they'd be getting elsewhere anyway. Then there were the pure entrepreneurs, people who saw a banned substance with high demand and low production costs and recognized a business opportunity. These individuals treated GHB manufacturing like any other hustle. They'd scale up production, develop distribution networks, recruit others to help with synthesis or sales and maximize profits. They had no personal attachment to the drug or its culture. It was just a product that happened to be profitable. And most disturbingly, there were predators who manufactured GHB specifically to use as a weapon. They'd make small batches for personal use in sexual assaults, never selling it, never distributing it, just maintaining their own supply of chemical incapacitation. These manufacturers were the hardest to catch because they weren't part of the distribution network law enforcement was monitoring. The actual production typically happened in residential settings. Someone's spare bedroom, a basement, a detached garage, spaces where strange smells or unusual activity might not immediately raise suspicion. The equipment was minimal and innocuous. Glass containers, plastic bottles, measuring cups, maybe a heating element. Nothing that would scream drug lab if someone happened to see it. The precursor chemicals were ordered online or purchased from industrial supply companies. GBL was sold as a wheel cleaner or paint stripper. BD was used in plastics manufacturing. As long as you had a business name, even a fake one, or were willing to sign a form saying you wouldn't use the chemicals for human consumption, you could buy them in bulk. Suppliers didn't ask questions because legally they didn't have to. The chemicals had legitimate uses, and what customers did with them after purchase wasn't the supplier's responsibility. The synthesis process itself varied in sophistication. Some manufacturers were meticulous, following proper chemistry procedures, measuring precisely, maintaining clean work environments, and testing their products. They'd keep detailed notes, adjust recipes based on results, and genuinely try to produce consistent, relatively safe batches. These were the minority. Most were sloppy. They'd mix chemicals in plastic bottles that could degrade and contaminate the product. They'd guess at measurements, about 2 cups of GBL, maybe 3 tablespoons of lye, creating unpredictable concentrations. They'd skip filtering steps, leaving particulates in the final product. They'd bottle too early before the reaction was complete, leaving dangerous precursors mixed with the GHB. Temperature control was often ignored. Chemical reactions can be exothermic, meaning they generate heat. If you add base to GBL too quickly without cooling, the temperature can spike, creating dangerous conditions and affecting the final product's quality. Amateur chemists would just dump everything together and hope for the best, occasionally resulting in overheated reactions that produced degraded or contaminated GHB. Safety precautions were minimal to non-existent. Strong bases like sodium hydroxide can cause severe burns on contact. Many home manufacturers didn't use gloves, eye protection, or proper ventilation. There are documented cases of people being hospitalized with chemical burns from GHB synthesis accidents, or suffering respiratory problems from inhaling fumes in enclosed spaces. Testing the final product was inconsistent at best. Professional labs use analytical chemistry techniques to verify concentration and purity. Home manufacturers would typically just taste it if it was salty and soapy. It was probably GHB, or tested on themselves by taking a small dose and seeing what happened. This works sometimes, but it couldn't catch subtle contamination or accurately determine concentration. Packaging and distribution were equally amateur. GHB would be bottled in whatever containers were available: empty water bottles, liquor bottles, shampoo bottles, even eye drop containers. Labels range from nothing at all to handwritten notes saying something like G or soap, a common street name. There was no standardization, no dosing information, no warnings. Some manufacturers developed reputations for quality within their communities. Word would spread, "Buy from this person, their stuff is clean." But these reputations were based on anecdotal experience, not actual testing. And even reputable manufacturers had bad batches occasionally. A mistaken measurement, a problem with precursor purity, contaminated equipment. Users had no way of knowing which batch they were getting. The profit margins were indeed substantial. A kilogram of GBL might cost $50 to $100. It could be converted into roughly a kilogram of GHB, which at rave prices of $1 to $2 per dose, roughly 1 gram, would sell for $1,000 to $2,000. Even accounting for losses in synthesis, packaging costs, and time invested, manufacturers could make 10 to 20 times their initial investment. For someone making a few batches a month, this translated to significant income, but the legal risks were severe. Manufacturing a controlled substance carried heavy criminal penalties, far worse than simple possession. If someone died from your product, or manslaughter or murder charges were possible, and law enforcement was increasingly focused on manufacturers rather than users, recognizing that cutting off supply was more effective than arresting individual consumers. Raids typically happened after someone overdosed and police traced the source. They'd interview friends, pull phone records, execute search warrants. When they hit a home lab, they'd seize chemicals, equipment, finished product, and any records or computers that might contain evidence. Arrests would follow, charges filed, and prosecutions pursued aggressively. Sentences for manufacturing could range from several years to decades, depending on scale and whether deaths were linked to the product. Yet despite these risks, the decentralized nature of GHB manufacturing meant it was nearly impossible to eliminate. There was no kingpin to arrest, no cartel to dismantle, no central distribution network to disrupt. Just hundreds or thousands of individuals in homes across the country, making small batches, selling locally, operating independently. Stopping one manufacturer did nothing to affect supply because 10 others were already filling the gap. GHB production had become a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more would grow in its place. Even after GHB itself was banned, manufacturers found a workaround. GBL, gamma-butyrolactone, and BD, 1,4-butanediol. These were chemical precursors that the human body naturally converted into GHB once ingested. Chemically, they were almost identical to GHB in effect, but technically they were legal because they had legitimate industrial uses. GBL was used in paint strippers, nail polish removers, and as a cleaning solvent. BD was found in plastics manufacturing. Neither was classified as a controlled substance, so sellers got creative. They'd bottle GBL or BD, slap a label on it that said industrial solvent, not for human consumption, and sell it openly online or in stores. Everyone knew what it was really for. The sellers knew. The buyers knew. Law enforcement knew. But because the label said the right things, it existed in this legal grey zone where nobody could touch it. Ravers and bodybuilders switched from GHB to GBL overnight. Same high, same risks, but now it was technically legal again. Except GBL and BD were even more dangerous than GHB because the conversion process in your body wasn't instant or predictable. The effects would take longer to kick in, people would assume they'd taken too little, and they'd dose again. Then both doses would convert to GHB at once, and the overdoses started piling up all over again. Finally, in the early 2000s, the government added GBL and BD to the controlled substances list, closing the loophole. But by then the damage was done. Another generation of users had learned how to get the same drug under a different name, and the cycle continued. Every time the law caught up, the chemistry found a way around it. It was whack-a-mole with molecules, and the molecules were winning. The GBL and BD loophole revealed fundamental problems with drug policy and chemical regulation. The substances were chemically distinct from GHB, but functionally equivalent because the human liver contained enzymes that converted them into GHB after ingestion. Yeah, this meant users could take GBL or BD and experience GHB's effects without technically taking GHB itself. It was the pharmaceutical equivalent of a technicality, and for several years it worked perfectly to circumvent the law. The conversion process was the key difference and the key danger. When you took GHB directly, it was absorbed through the stomach and began affecting the brain within 15 to 30 minutes. But when you took GBL or BD, your body had to metabolize it first. The liver would gradually convert the precursor into GHB over time, meaning the effects were delayed and prolonged. This created new overdose scenarios that were even harder to predict. People who switched from GHB to GBL expecting similar timing were caught off guard. They'd take a dose of GBL and wait. 30 minutes, nothing. 45 minutes, still nothing. Thinking it was weak or fake, they'd take more. But what they didn't realize was that the first dose was still being metabolized, still converting to GHB in their system, just slowly. When they took the second dose, they didn't double their GHB level, they tripled or quadrupled it, because now they had 2 doses of precursor converting simultaneously. The delayed onset also meant people would continue drinking, dancing, and engaging in activities that wouldn't mix well with GHB effects. By the time they felt the drug kicking in, they'd already consumed alcohol, exerted themselves physically, and potentially taken other substances. Then the full effects would hit all at once, creating situations where someone would go from feeling mostly sober to completely incapacitated in a matter of minutes. The prolonged duration was another problem. GHB typically lasted 2 to 4 hours, but because GBL and BD were converted gradually, their effects could last 6 to 8 hours or more. People would wake up still impaired, unable to drive safely or function normally, surprised that they were still high many hours after dosing. Despite these additional dangers, GBL and BD became extremely popular, specifically because they were legal. Companies would sell them openly on websites, sometimes with disclaimers about not being for human consumption, but with descriptions that made their intended use obvious. Bottles would have names like Renutrient or Reviverant or simply GBL, not exactly hiding what they were. The websites would feature testimonials about improved sleep, better recovery, and euphoric feelings. Everyone understood the code. Head shops and supplement stores sold them over the counter. You could walk in, ask for GBL, pay cash, and walk out legally, no questions asked. For users who were nervous about buying illegal drugs or didn't have connections to underground sources, this was ideal. They could get the same high they wanted without the legal risk of purchasing a controlled substance. The industrial supply market was even easier. Companies selling chemicals for legitimate purposes would ship GBL or BD in bulk to anyone with a credit card. 5 gallons of GBL would arrive at your door in a few days, enough to last months, or to resell at enormous profit. Law enforcement couldn't do anything because purchasing a legal chemical, even in large quantities, wasn't a crime. The bodybuilding community embraced GBL and BD enthusiastically. For them, the ban on GHB had been frustrating because they viewed it as a supplement, not a drug. When GBL became available as a legal alternative, they saw it as vindication. Forums and websites shared information about proper dosing, conversion times, and effects. Many bodybuilders genuinely believed they were using a safe legal product. The rave scene was more divided. Some users preferred GBL because of its legality and availability. Others stuck with GHB from underground sources, distrusting the precursors or preferring the faster onset. But overall, GBL became widely used, and the overdose patterns just shifted rather than declining. Predators adapted too. GBL and BD could be used for the same purposes as GHB, slipped into drinks, causing incapacitation and amnesia. The delayed onset actually made them more insidious in some ways, because victims would leave a venue feeling fine, only to become impaired during the car ride home or after arriving somewhere else, when they were more isolated and vulnerable. Medical professionals watched this shift with horror. Emergency rooms started seeing overdoses that looked like GHB, but with longer duration and more complex presentation. Tox screens would come back negative for GHB initially, because the patient had taken a precursor that hadn't fully converted yet. Doctors had to learn new protocols, test for metabolites rather than just GHB itself, and adjust treatment strategies. The FDA and DEA recognized the problem but moved slowly. Scheduling a new substance as controlled required formal processes, public comment periods, and regulatory procedures that took time. Meanwhile, overdoses continued, assaults continued, and deaths continued. Advocacy groups pressured the government to act faster, but bureaucracy doesn't move at the speed of a drug crisis. When GBL was finally added to the controlled substances list in 2000, there was hope the problem would resolve. But the same pattern repeated. Suppliers immediately switched to other precursors or analogues, chemicals that were slightly different structurally but had similar effects. 4-butanediol, BD, became the new alternative, at least until it too was scheduled in 2001. Even after both major precursors were banned, synthesis from scratch remained easy for anyone willing to try. The chemical knowledge was widespread, recipes were documented online, and raw materials for synthesis were still accessible. The loophole had been closed legally, but practically little change for those determined to obtain GHB. The GBL and BD saga illustrated a fundamental challenge in drug policy. Chemistry moves faster than law. For every substance banned, there are dozens of analogues that could potentially be used instead. Creating a comprehensive policy requires either scheduling entire chemical classes, which can interfere with legitimate industrial and medical uses, or playing eternal catch-up as users and manufacturers stay one step ahead. It also showed that legality strongly influences drug use patterns. When GBL was legal, use expanded dramatically because the barrier to access dropped. People who would never buy illegal drugs were willing to purchase a legal chemical. Even if they knew its intended use was the same, the legal status provided psychological permission and practical convenience that drove adoption. In the end, the loophole was closed, but not before exposing how ineffective single-substance bans could be against a problem rooted in chemistry and demand rather than in any particular molecule. The GHB story was really a story about a class of substances and a desired effect, and banning one formulation didn't eliminate either of those underlying drivers. It just forced a temporary detour that cost more lives before regulators could catch up. Behind every statistic, every overdose report, every news headline about GHB, there were real people, and their stories were devastating. There was the college student who took GHB at a party, thinking it was a safe alternative to alcohol, and never woke up. Their parents found out about the drug only after reading the autopsy report. There was the woman who'd been slipped GHB at a bar and woke up 12 hours later in a stranger's apartment with no memory of how she got there or what had been done to her. She reported it to the police, but without evidence or memory, the case went nowhere. There was the guy who took GHB every weekend for months, convinced he had it under control, until one night he took just a little too much, and his friends found him face down in a puddle of his own vomit, barely breathing. The paramedics saved him, but he never touched the drug again. There were the high school kids who heard GHB was like alcohol but better and tried it at a house party. One of them ended up in a coma. The other spent the night in a hospital waiting room, terrified. He's sobbing, praying their friend would wake up. And there were the predators, men who deliberately used GHB as a weapon, who planned their attacks, who targeted vulnerable people, who walked away without consequences because the drug erased the evidence along with the memories. These stories didn't make the news often. They were too messy, too tragic, too uncomfortable. But they were everywhere. In every city, In every community, people were being hurt by GHB, and most of the time, nobody even knew it was happening until it was too late. The drug didn't discriminate. It didn't care if you were careful or reckless, experienced or naive, at a rave or at a bar. If you took too much, or if someone gave it to you without your knowledge, you were at its mercy. And GHB had no mercy. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 19, a sophomore at a state university studying to become a teacher. On a Friday night in 1997, she went to a club with her roommates to celebrate the end of midterms. She had 2 drinks, maybe 3. She was dancing, laughing, having fun. And then nothing. She woke up 14 hours later in a hospital bed. The doctors told her she'd been found unconscious in a parking lot behind the club. Someone had called 911. She'd nearly stopped breathing. They'd had to intubate her. And she had injuries that suggested sexual assault. Sarah had no memory of any of it. Not leaving the club, not the assault, not the ambulance ride. Nothing. She reported it to the police, but without being able to identify her attacker or even describe what had happened, the investigation stalled. She dropped out of school that semester. Last anyone heard, she was still in therapy, still having nightmares about hours she couldn't remember. Or consider James. He was a bodybuilder in his mid-20s using GHB for sleep and recovery. He was careful, or so he thought. Same dose every night, measured precisely, never mixed with alcohol. It worked for over a year. Then one night he took his usual dose, went to bed, and never woke up. His girlfriend found him the next morning, cold and unresponsive. The autopsy showed GHB in his system, but at levels that shouldn't have been fatal for someone with his tolerance. The medical examiner concluded he'd had an idiosyncratic reaction, possibly related to an undiagnosed heart condition, but ultimately ruled it death by GHB intoxication. His family, who hadn't known he was using the drug, were devastated and confused. Their son, healthy and athletic, dead at 26 from something they'd never heard of. Then there was the group of friends in their early 20s who went to a rave together. 4 of them took GHB that night. 3 woke up the next day. The 4th, Tyler, was found in the bathroom, collapsed in a locked stall. By the time someone broke down the door and found him, he'd been without oxygen for too long. He survived, technically. But the brain damage was severe. He never fully recovered cognitive function. His family took care of him for years, watching him struggle with memory, motor control, and basic tasks he'd once done without thinking. His friends, racked with guilt, drifted apart. They couldn't look at each other without remembering that night, without wondering if they'd checked on him sooner, if things would have been different. There was the high school girl, 16 years old, who was given GHB at a party by someone she thought was her friend. She woke up to find pictures of her assault posted on social media. The humiliation was unbearable. The police got involved, the photos were eventually removed, but the damage was done. She attempted suicide twice before her 18th birthday. Her parents moved to another state, trying to give her a fresh start. But you can't move away from trauma that lives in your own mind. Or the man in his 30s, married with 2 kids, who used GHB recreationally at sex parties. He was open with his wife about it, had rules about safety and dosing. One night, he mixed GHB with alcohol, something he'd always avoided. He stopped breathing in the car on the way home, his wife driving, and he didn't notice until she got to a stoplight and looked over. She pulled into a parking lot, called 911, started CPR. The paramedics revived him, but the experience shattered something in their marriage. The trust, the sense of safety, it never fully came back. They divorced within a year, and there was the bartender who watched helplessly as a regular customer, someone she'd served dozens of times, suddenly collapsed at the bar. She called 911 immediately, but in the 10 minutes it took for the ambulance to arrive, she had to watch this young man, barely 25, turn blue, stop breathing, and slip into unconsciousness. The paramedics revived him with difficulty. He survived, but she never forgot the terror of those minutes. She quit bartending not long after and never went back. There was the mother who found a tiny bottle in her son's room while doing laundry. She didn't know what it was, so she Googled it. What she found made her blood run cold. Page after page about overdoses, deaths, date rape. She confronted her son, who insisted he was careful, that he knew what he was doing. 3 weeks later, she got the call from the hospital. He'd survived, but barely. She sat at his bedside and wept, thinking about all the ways she'd failed to protect him from something she didn't even know existed. And there were the countless women, thousands, tens of thousands, who woke up in unfamiliar places with fragmented memories and physical evidence of assault. Most never reported it. They showered, trying to wash away what had happened, destroying evidence in the process. They told themselves it was their fault for not being more careful, for leaving their drink unattended, for trusting the wrong person. They carried the weight of trauma and shame alone, never knowing if they'd been drugged or just drunk, never getting the support or justice they deserved. These weren't statistics. They were daughters and sons, friends and lovers, people with dreams and plans and futures that were stolen or destroyed by a clear liquid in a bottle. Each story was unique, but they all shared common threads: underestimated risk, trust betrayed, lives changed in an instant, and afterward, a world that often didn't want to hear about it, because the stories were too painful, too complicated, too messy. But ignoring these stories didn't make them less real. It just meant the lessons they offered went unlearned, and the tragedies kept repeating over and over in cities and towns across the country as GHB continued its quiet, devastating work. So here we are, at the end of a story that never really ended. GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, liquid ecstasy, G, whatever name you knew it by, was supposed to be a medical breakthrough, a safe anesthetic, a sleep aid for bodybuilders. Instead, it became one of the most dangerous and misunderstood substances of the 1990s, a chemical that promised euphoria and delivered unconsciousness, amnesia, and too often, death. We've travelled through the entire arc of this drug's dark journey, from the laboratory where it was first synthesized with good intentions to the supplement shelves where it was sold to unsuspecting bodybuilders, to the sweaty warehouses and strobe-lit clubs where it became a rave staple, and finally into the hands of predators who weaponized it against the most vulnerable. Along the way, we've seen the overdoses that nobody remembered, the hospital visits that vanished from memory, the sexual assaults that couldn't be prosecuted, and the deaths that should have been prevented. The story of GHB is a story about how good intentions can go horribly wrong, about how a substance created to help people ended up hurting them, about how the line between medicine and poison is often just a matter of dose, context, and knowledge. It's about the failure of drug policy to keep pace with chemistry, the failure of the legal system to protect victims, and the failure of a culture to prioritize safety over sensation. But more than anything, it's a story about people. Real people with real lives who trusted the wrong person, took the wrong dose, or were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The college student who never got to finish their degree, the woman who never got justice for what was done to her, the friend group torn apart by a death that should never have happened, the parents who buried children they thought were just going out to dance. These weren't cautionary tales when they happened. They were tragedies. They were lives cut short or forever altered by a clear liquid in a bottle that looked harmless, but carried devastation in every drop. And the cruelest part is that most of these tragedies were preventable, not through abstinence-only scare tactics or just say no campaigns, but through honest education, harm reduction, better drug policy, and a culture that valued safety over status and people over parties. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, carry these stories with you, not to give you nightmares, but to remind you that the world is full of both danger and love, both exploitation and protection, both chemicals that can kill you and people who will fight to save you. Be one of the latter. Watch out for your friends. Question things that seem too good to be true. Trust your gut. And if you see someone in trouble, be the person who helps, not the person who walks away. The rave scene had a saying: peace, love, unity, respect. GHB violated every one of those principles. It brought violence instead of peace, exploitation instead of love, isolation instead of unity, and predation instead of respect. But the ideal behind those words still matters. In a world where substances like GHB exist, where people are vulnerable and others are cruel, choosing to embody those principles, actually protecting each other, actually creating safe spaces, actually respecting consent and boundaries, isn't naive idealism. It's survival. The salty, soapy taste of GHB has faded from the mouths of those who tasted it, but the bitter lessons it left behind should not fade from our collective memory. Remember the ravers who danced until they dropped. Remember the victims who lost hours of their lives to a drug they never chose to take. Remember the parents who buried children. Remember the friends who carry guilt for not knowing what to do. Remember them all, not with pity, but with a commitment to do better, to be better, to create a world where fewer people have to learn these lessons the hard way. Because history may be full of chemicals and consequences, but it's also proof that humans can learn, can adapt, can protect each other if they choose to. The story of GHB is a tragedy, yes, but it doesn't have to be the only story we tell. We can write new chapters, ones where education replaces ignorance, where harm reduction replaces punishment, where community replaces isolation, and where every person matters more than any high ever could. So sleep well tonight. You've learned something dark, something true, something that matters, and tomorrow, maybe you'll use that knowledge to watch out for someone, to question something, to be the person who makes a difference when it counts. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Carry the lessons of the past forward. Honour those who suffered by trying to prevent future suffering. And remember that even in the darkest stories, there's always room for the light of human compassion to break through. Rest now. The story of GHB may not have ended, but your part in preventing the next chapter starts with knowledge, with care, and with the simple choice to look out for each other in a world that doesn't always make that easy. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Good night.